Hello, today is August 22nd, 2018. This is the kubeadm office hours for SIG cluster lifecycle. It looks like we have a pretty packed agenda. Starting off with Fabrizio. Fabrizio, you want to talk about this?
Yes, can you hear me? Okay, so I have, if there are no priorities, I would like to give some updates on the job that I'm completing. And I will start with the join control plane, which is nearly finished. There is only one PR pending. There is a question that is just a request for help. If there is someone can point me out on a canonical way to detect the node on the node where I am, and I will also pass also the question on Slack. And what is important to be aware is that, okay, the join -- control master is kind of related to the API changes. I'm not sure that we can resolve all the dependencies between the two activities, but this is not a problem because you can do join -- control master even without the change of the config by using flex. And it would be really useful for me if someone can start testing on this, because basically I'm the only one who tested this feature.
We sadly...
Okay, next topic is the... Please go on.
Sadly, we had a resource dedicated to testing, but he's been diverted. I don't know if we will have a dedicated person to test, and we don't actually have automation in place to stand up the HA configuration for 112. We can try, we need to do a refresh of the documentation. As part of the refresh of the documentation, it should force exercising this particular path. So we can use it as a forcing function. But I don't, so long as the feature gets in now and we enqueue the docs change to get done within 112 timeframe for this stuff, we can use it as a forcing function.
But we are documenting, if I remember well, we decided to not document alpha features.
That is true. We can leave the current documentation the way it is. It's a little unwieldy. The control plane join simplifies things.
Okay, so let's keep this in mind. It will be useful to test, and we will keep the opportunity to fix documentation or improve documentation to test it. Then we decide if and how to make it public more than the release notes.
It's fine to me if we want to just get it in there for the time being, and then because it's experimental, we should have resources in 113, at least from our side, dedicated to testing, spinning back through. I don't know if other folks actually have folks who can exercise the entire rigmarole there. Also in 113, we will rejig the deployment from using Kubernetes Anywhere to using Cluster API. So long as I'm going to force that.
Sorry, that's for the testing harness, Tim?
That's for the default deployment for the testing harness. Yes.
Sweet.
For the periodic suite.
So I think a release node is sufficient for the -- control plane. And we can leave it to people to test it and mark it as experimental, basically. Because we don't have the resource to test it right now.
I can promise to spin up an HA cluster, or at least attempt to do so, at least when I'm doing the kube conformance for 112.
That would be great.
We should try to make sure that that works earlier on than like after we release Kubernetes. So
if you can update the default dev deployment to be HA, I don't know if that's possible or not. So that way, leave the same vagrant goopery, for the lack of a better term, is used across both.
yeah, Fabrizio has been using that for development of this. So
and I'm using to testing it. We can synchronize.
We can also check to make sure it works with DND cluster. I was just working with Hippie Hacker yesterday on that.
I don't know how you work to get a master join scenario in a DND cluster without having separate DNDs, and how you get the network to work all right. That's a lot of jiggery.
The DND clusters already support multi-node. That's one of the biggest use cases there. So you just spin one up, and then you should be able to turn any of the workers into a master.
I'd be interested in seeing it. That sounds really magical with a K. But if it does work, that's great actually, because this would actually simplify. If it's possible, it would greatly simplify some of the automation.
Fabrizio, I haven't had a chance to look at the specs. Do you have to supply an external load balancer for the control plane join?
Yes, and an external etcd.
External etcd, external LB. And then we have a guide on how to stack the etcds, but the load balancer is still very environment dependent, right?
Yes. In the Vagrant, in the kubeadm playground, so in the Vagrant jiggery, I'm using ucar. So some Linux utilities to have a VIP. Basically, I'm not even using a load balancer. But there are many ways, keep alive, whatever. So
yeah, I'll give it a go.
Are there any other questions with the control plane join? Thanks for all the work, Fabrizio, and seeing this through. I know it's taken several releases to get this all the way through, and it's dated back to like a bunch of configuration changes that had occurred across several cycles to make it possible and not onerous, right, to do this. So I appreciate the patience and the fortitude in seeing this through across several releases.
Some seriously hard stuff. Yeah. Next point.
I moved up your point because before starting talking about the API, it's better to late.
Next. Do we want to move on to the next topic? Okay. User feedback on self-hosting deprecation.
Yeah, I put this bullet point on here because I did reach out to Mike since we were talking about dropping this feature yesterday. And Mike gladly decided to join the call. So I just wanted to give him a forum to talk about how they're using self-hosting on their clusters at Ocado. There's some pretty interesting use cases there. Yeah, take away, Mike.
Sure. Yeah, currently we're using kubeadm phases to do the certs and secrets part, and part of the pivot. Got details escape me for bits. We have to do slightly bit of our own pivots because we're running our own manifests. We run our API servers as deployments floating across the entire cluster, along with all the other control plane components. so we found the phases quite nice for doing that. Certainly, if there's no one else in the community that's actually making use of this, we can just maintain this ourselves. But yeah, we found that feature really nice. So I'm disappointed that it's going away. But
so the one thing that we're doing, just so there's clarity here, which we should probably log an issue for, is that we just don't want kubeadm. We think that this piece of pivoting and management of it is separable, right? So it doesn't necessarily belong in kubeadm proper, and it actually complicates a bunch of workflow issues with both upgrades as well as control plane join, as well as other different operations that kubeadm needs to support. So we'd absolutely welcome, like, because it is a SIG, and the SIG offers many tools, right? This is the kubeadm office hours, but the SIG in general would gladly support a pivoter tool that would take a given manifest and do the exact same pivot routine. And we could even take the code out of kubeadm proper into its own utility to do those types of pivoting, right? So we don't want to say we're not endorsing it. We're just saying that we're removing it from kubeadm proper to simplify the control path. And should other people want to do this, we'll absolutely be supportive of folks creating a tool and building in the community the tool support external to kubeadm proper. Right?
Yeah, cool. Thanks for the clarification. Yeah, I can totally get behind that decision. That's fine. But I would like to say thank you for all the work there, because that's been a really useful tool. And certainly the rest of kubeadm will still be useful in that path. So.
Yeah, even just managing all the config flags and techniques for configuring the components is, I think, the biggest value add of kubeadm still currently. Is this something that bootkube could be retrofitted to use? Like, could we import manifests from kubeadm and bootkube them?
From my understanding, bootkube is dead beef. No, I don't exactly know how it's going to live on and support going forwards. Now that that world is changing still, and the story is changing. So there are no representatives that I'm aware of on this call who actually represent that space anymore. So I don't want to speak to it. All I know is that some things have been deprecated, and I don't know the state of that stuff anymore.
How much code are we talking about extracting here from kubeadm? Like 2 phase files and a library?
Oh, you mean for the pivoting? The pivoting extraction is relatively small. It's a couple of phase files, yes. The other upgrade and join semantics is more.
Yes, but the upgrade basically creates static pods and then pivot again.
Yeah.
So it's not too much code.
Yeah, the upgrade side of things we're less interested in, because once we've done the kubeadm bootstrap to pivot self-hosting, thereafter our entire control plane is just bundled in with the rest of the application deployments. So we just do upgrades by doing a kubectl apply, and the cluster orchestrates the upgrade for us.
And you just manage flags for config that way?
Yeah, all manifests are just in our bundles of config.
What are you doing for kubelets? How do you manage that?
Kubelets are separate. They're just on the immutable node infrastructure, replaceable nodes.
Okay. Yeah, because the 111 upgrades. Are you using 111 yet, Mike?
Not yet.
Okay.
We've gotten a bit stuck with other priorities.
Well,
May I ask, how do you
dynamic config now? But,
may I ask how do you manage the cluster, the complete cluster failure, the restart after a complete cluster failure?
Right now we're using a modified version of the bootkube checkpointer.
Okay.
Thankfully, we haven't actually hit that.
So the reason why I reached out to Mike is just like after hours of conversation at KubeCon Copenhagen, it was pretty easy to identify that they're doing some pretty novel things in this space. They were early adopters of bootkube before they migrated to kubeadm. I think Mike and his team have a lot of authority in regard to self-hosting. I know like there's business priorities and everything, right? That's like the whole thing with open source these days is how do you fund all of this work? But yeah, if you want to continue to be a voice in regard to the self-hosting story, we're happy to be a home for you. Cluster Lifecycle is absolutely the place to advocate for a self-hosting story. It sounds like you're accepting of dropping the feature from kubeadm.
I can totally understand the reasoning.
I'm not convinced that this wouldn't be equally as maintainable as like a separate command line entry point in kubeadm, but we could probably chat about that. Like, I don't know if this has to be extracted out into its own tool to be maintainable. Extracting into its own tool would require probably another repository or something, but it would probably allow us to release on a higher frequency cadence for that.
I'm okay with having a separate subcommand for this to maintain for the time being, because it already exists in phases. I just want to make sure that the standard upgrade path and join path are clean, because the problem with the join and upgrade for control plane additions became really weird with Fabrizio's original PR. There was a bunch of if-then else cases for self-hosting versus other. And as long as we keep those two worlds separate, I don't care. And in a grand unified world where we actually have component config sprinkled throughout, still having that code eventually allows us to potentially offer people who are in the HA environment that bit flip option for management.
Yeah. One thing we also identified yesterday was that kubeadm doesn't have like a back pivot logic. Is that something that you can actually make happen with phases, Mike?
Back pivot?
Yeah, pivoting back from the HA control plane into static pods.
Oh. No idea, not something we've ever thought of.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, well, that might be something that would belong in that subcommand. Okay. Yeah, I agree completely, Tim. I think we should excise the actual logic from the critical path.
I'm preparing the PR for. I'm preparing the PR for the deprecation, and I'm only. I'm not deleting the code that does the pivoting. So it will be available for another cycle, this code.
Cool. Maybe, I mean, is this considered a feature if we add a subcommand to access that code this cycle? Or is that something that I can do after?
It will be accessible via the phases.
Oh, it's still accessible via the phases.
Yes, without.
Okay, and then you're just removing it from the init and upgrade logic. So
I'm only avoiding the usage of the feature flag. So, and I'm not doing the code cleanup because we are too late in the cycle.
That makes sense to me. So I guess technically from Mike's standpoint, we're not even deprecating the feature. We're just getting rid of the flag. Okay, cool.
Basically, yes. Now it is due to the time. It is only a UX change for the main workflow. So in Ocado they could continue to use for another cycle.
I also think it's nice that it's a separate phases subcommand that eventually stuff like this could be its own set of subcommands, would have to be explicitly run in order for them to opt into certain features, because there are caveats, a bunch of issues that come along with it, right? Like you're running bootkube to solve your problem, right? And I have no idea what the long LTS for that is going to be, as well as what the potential integration for actual real checkpointing is going to be in the long term in the kubelet. So like there is a alpha-ish feature that exists in the kubelet today, but the whole full state space of security issues that kind of came along with this, and the reason why we decided not to do it is a long tail of complication, because there are a bunch of security implications that are the reasons why we no longer want to support this as a first class thing, right? Going forwards.
Yeah. It sounds to me like the concise conclusion is that we want to deprecate the init upgrade feature flag and excise the pivot code from the critical path for normal kubeadm usage. We'll leave the code in phases, recognizing that we've identified that phases are useful for a couple of ad hoc user actions that in the future, beyond the 1.12 release, may be given their own first class subcommands when we change the UX of Kubernetes. Okay. And also, thanks for joining the call, Mike. I think we've really lacked a user and a voice for this feature, and like really any understanding about it for quite a while. So really appreciate the time.
No problem. Thanks for inviting me to talk. Hopefully we'll upgrade to a newer version of Kubernetes in the near future. But yeah.
Yeah, the new API aggregation stuff coming from, like Nikita and et cetera, API machinery, that stuff's so nice. So yeah, got to get on the CRD train. Right? Everybody's making CRDs these days.
So we might have hidden users of this feature. So I wonder how we should address announcing the change. Should it be in the notes?
We should be in the release notes. It was already an alpha feature. We reserve all rights around alpha features. So as a result, we can just make sure that the release note for this particular one says that you can still use it by using the alpha phases subcommand. So long as that exists, then it should be okay. With regards to upgrades, that's going to be a little bit weird because people kind of manage their upgrades differently once they start getting into self-hosting. So I think we'll deal with that as it comes. But again, we'll have to just make sure that the release notes are clear and we go through with a fine-tooth comb and add extra details there. But it's already been stated that we've removed all alpha documentation from the mainline. Documentation. So people have had to have known and understood and opted into some of this stuff.
Yeah, hopefully we're not going to get any issue reports about this. And even if we get some, we're going to explain the situation again. Yeah, so that's fine.
Just so that I have a clear map of why we're doing this. The main conflict in the control flow comes from control plane join and self-hosted living together, right?
That's a part of it. There's also the implications of supported checkpointing, and we don't have an official path, right? So there's a whole state space of things that exist, but there's nothing that's actually fully supported. There's no, and even every single choice we've walked down has a bunch of security implications, right? Bootkube chose to go a certain route that still has security implications. The other choices that we went had less of them, but didn't solve all the problems, right? So at this time, because it's complicated and because the cost benefit of doing some of these other features, and we want to get kubeadm to GA first, it makes a ton of sense to simplify the logic in kubeadm and to just get the other features in that we would like to have to get to GA. And then should folks really want this feature in the community, we can absolutely try to make that happen. But I don't want to be on the critical path to GA and try to make all the other implications viable, right? That's too high of a cost, too high of a burden. And we've already paid down a ton of that cost over time.
Lubomir, is that you taking notes?
No, it's not me.
I've wrote some note about the how Kado is using self-hosting, and also about the idea to consider a separated subcommand for self-hosting, pivoting, and pivoting in future.
Cool, sweet. We can probably move on if nobody else has other concerns. I know that there are some larger topics here.
I think it's all Fabrizio for the rest of it.
Yeah. So I wrote in the meeting notes the daily status about how is going the change on the config file, and I wrote also two main decisions or point that I want to share with the SIG. The first one is that we are not going to cut V1 beta 1, but we will go with V1 alpha 3 because we are too late in the cycle. And second is that we are trying to get into as much as possible change in the V1 alpha 3, and this is done. And this should be done considering the current status. And the current status, basically, there are 3 threads of activities. One is finalizing the restructuring of the API. And if possible, we will also go in detail on this afterwards. And the second, but we are almost well shaped. Might be that we will miss the restructuring of add-ons and some minor improvements. The second thread of activity is to properly use the new configuration structure when we are doing upgrades. And currently today I tested, now it is broken, so we have to fix it and make it work properly. Managing the different scenario, upgrading from 1.11 to 1.12, and from the two from V1 alpha 2 to V1 alpha 3, or V1 alpha 3 to V1 alpha 3, because there will be differences. And the third thread of activity is code cleanup. So after all the changes to the API, there is chance and room for improving. This third thread is kind of on hold because we are waiting for the first two to complete. And that's a high level the status update. And
I'm going to walk through Ross's change hopefully as soon as I can today. The problem with massive API changes is they're massive, and there's a lot of finagly things in some of our machinery that I don't quite understand why they're there, to be honest. We have some custom jiggery around fuzz testing and API conversions that doesn't exist in some other API machinery stuff. So I need to dig through the details there.
I learned a lot in the last 2 weeks. So if you want, I can help you. And there is this PR which is blocking the other change. And then I don't know if there are no other topic to discuss. I would like to take the opportunity to ask some opinion about the API changes. So I can have some, we can do some code design, or I can have some early feedback before sending the PRs.
Before you do that, are there any questions with regards to the details of what Fabrizio has been talking about? There's a lot of data there.
I see that the PKI helpers changed. Like I was going to try to review this because I've touched so much of that code. This is blocked by another API change. Is that I'm trying to grok what you're saying right there.
Which PR are you talking about?
This is 67542. Here, let me link it.
Thank you.
This is relatively massive.
Yeah, I can explain. Basically, we are splitting init configuration into init configuration and cluster configuration. This PR is a set of refactoring that change function which are using init configuration to use only cluster configuration. Why I put on hold on this PR is because due to the change that are still missing, there are some change in this PR that must be reverted if they go in. So it is better from my point of view to wait that all the changes to the API are there, or at least the 2 or 3 big changes that are missing. Otherwise, we risk to do rework.
So there's a lot of context here with regards to why we're shifting the configuration and separating pieces out. Part of it has to do with dependency and only having the pieces you need for a given operation use the configuration that is required. So the join only has its configuration, but there's also a separation of concerns that was invoked as part of this. So that way the configuration was broken apart because originally the master configuration actually subsumed the sub-elements of the component configuration for other things. That was part of the 1.10 breakage that occurred. So part of this is to get rid of that dependency directly in the master config. It's a plan for long-term separation for us to have all the pieces of config in place where only the parties for the given operation need the portion of the config that are required to do their given operation.
So I would love more opinions about this. I'm glad that we're kind of getting into the art of putting software together right now, because if you read Cloud Native Infrastructure, Chris and Justin advocate for doing exactly the opposite of this. When doing like declarative declaration-based infrastructure modification, they say that you want to pass like the entire struct through in order to provide flexibility in responding to other infrastructure changes. This is actually the reason why store certs and secrets is broken right now. I looked at implementing the change back when we did the etcd SSL upgrade, and the cert mutation functions, which is a relatively complex structure that was implemented, they did not have access to the structs necessary for the etcd information. And so I couldn't get the etcd certificate paths without like going up 5 levels of indirection. And that's not an exaggeration. I had to try and go up, and it started passing the struct down, and then I started messing up, and there was closures. So I don't know. It's safer and more sane for sure to be passing like the minimal structs necessary all the way through, but like I'm not sure what we can do to like handle this other development need, which is that as requirements change, like the schema is going to need to be flexible enough for us to access it.
No, this is a good point, but there was two big concerns to be addressed. The first is component config. Basically, before we were embedding component config in our master config. But being each component config versioned and managed by other team, basically we were linking the life cycle of our API to the life cycle of the embedded structure. What does that mean? That every time the kube proxy or the kubelet will change a field, we will be forced to cut a new release of the new API. And this is not maintainable in the future if you think that we will have a component config, not only 2 component config, but more. So the first big reason for API redesign was to have a lazy dependencies between our API and the component config API. This was the first main reason for the redesign. The second problem was that in the master configuration, we were conflicting different set of information, like the information about the node where you were initializing the cluster, and the information that apply to the whole cluster. And basically, now we need more instances of the information regarding to the master node. Otherwise, we were not capable to provide a sustainable story for the upgrades in an exchange.
Yeah, I also want to make sure that, like, those are the reason, because it's part of the reason. There's also a reason around the grand unification of component config, and that's a whole separate working effort that Lucas has been pushing really hard on, even though he's somewhere in the woods. Plus, I also want to push back against the assertion I don't know the exact excerpt, but I've got like a decade plus in cluster management. I hate using that term, because I don't like using that coin, but I can give you concrete examples of how conflating configuration causes dependency graph problems that are almost impossible to separate out once you want to refactor something. Right? I really don't like using that coin, but
so we do want attention to detail in function signatures about what structs we're passing around is what you're getting at.
Yeah, we want to make sure that we're not over allowing dependency graph proliferation for, so say if we want to change something else that's should be totally unrelated from A to B, or we would think that, right? We don't want to have this separate component way down in the graph depending upon something up the stack. And this is analogous to a bunch of things inside of Borg itself, where people depended on labels, right? This is also analogous to other things in Condor, where people also developed specific class adds. And all of a sudden, the system became too onerous to change because the dependencies were too wrought throughout the system.
Cool. Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying and providing a contrasting anecdote. Because yeah, when I read that, I was skeptical, but also could like feel my pain in dealing with this.
I think we need to be careful though too. I think your point shouldn't go unheard. I think we need to be mindful that we give enough information down the stack, and we're clearly thinking about it over time, so that way we can refine the scope. Because we don't want to have ridiculous pain points in the code where you need information. In order for you to get it, you have to plumb all the way up and all the way down again, right? That's the contrary thing, the other side of the coin.
I'm pretty satisfied with this banter. I want to also bring up, while we're talking about all of this time spending on config, has anybody paid attention to versioning and preserving and plumbing in the previous version of the config into the code? Because certain things have just been very impossible to handle in upgrades without the previous version of the cluster config. You have to like introspect the node or do some very peculiar things in order to figure out what to do in the upgrade. I'm thinking specifically to the etcd TLS upgrade, where we had to basically serialize pod manifests from the previous version of the cluster in order to determine, and then like count flags and stuff.
That was kind of that plus the proxy were kind of, I don't know how to describe it. There were edge cases, unfortunate edge cases that weren't planned into the configuration of the machinery. I saw Jason turn on his screen, so he wants to talk, so I'm gonna let him talk.
Well, I was just going to say we need to be careful about how we handle stored config as well, because right now we don't have a way to actually mutate a running cluster outside of an upgrade. So if people actually make changes to components, they'd be making changes to the actual components on disk instead of on the stored config that we have. So I think in general, we need to be cautious about relying on, any stored previous config, because it doesn't necessarily represent the actual state of the system unless we're doing some type of reconciliation.
Does component config have an API associated with it? So can I get the scheduler command line configuration from some reliable place?
It does, and it's being first classed. So that's the work that Lucas is working on. So it does have an API, okay. And we're working to actually make a first classed set of libraries that you can leverage in the client as a separate utility.
I mean, that's probably enough. It gets a little weird because those components are distributed, so I have no real idea what that would look like. Would that be a per instance API or a collection style API?
Component config is a cluster wide. For the kube proxy, you have the configuration of all the kube proxy, which is shared between all the instances, and the same goes for kubelet. Then you can have instance settings, which is one of the problems of the API model. But just to answer to the note from Jason, one of the activity which is in pipeline is, for instance, to remove from the kubeadmin config map, to remove the component config, and to have only one authoritative source for the component config, which is the one actually used by the components. And this will fix this for the kubeadmin part, and the extra the real fix is there will be to implement kubeconfig update command, which mutate your cluster without doing upgrades. This is something that I don't remember which whom I discussed, but now update and upgrades are kind of conflicted. But I think that in future we have to split these two features.
So there could also be situations where it's not the semantics around the upgrade aren't necessarily around the component config as well. For example, with kube proxy right now, there's a workaround that you need to do in some environments to where you have to use you have to add an init container to kind of modify the actual component config to be on a per host basis to override the host name. That type of thing right now would be completely blown out of the water with an upgrade right now.
Well, that's part of the work change to get it into component config, especially for the proxies, to fix these problems, because there are separate issues with regards to how we unify handling of config command line args across the different components, because of this issue that occurred not just on the proxy, but it actually had occurred in the kubelet too before.
Yes, the problem for in the new API design, it will be simpler to have configuration per instance. But for the kube proxy, there is also an issue that the kube proxy does not allow to mix flags and config. So from our side, we are moving in that direction, but also kubeproxy must be ready to accept this, like it is kubelet now, for instance.
Yeah, I just wanted to raise that, you know, we could run into issues that aren't solved by the component config itself.
Yeah, sadly, I don't know how to solve this problem other than I wish every component would get together and buy into the whole process and have an effort across all SIGs to make this unified going forwards. But Lucas is doing a superhuman effort right now to try and make this go with the API machinery folks.
We really need to unbox the original PR about splitting the init configuration in cluster configuration. If you, Tim, and Fabrizio can possibly get this going, I mean, we should continue with the effort because we don't want to end up in a state where for 112 we are kind of broken.
Very good. So we have time for a little review of a quick review of the API. Then let me share my desktop. So here I tried to summarize what we are doing. This is the current status now. Now we moved from the original master configuration, and basically we have init configuration, where we have bootstrap token, which is basically runtime attributes. So attributes that are used by kubeadm init, but not part of the cluster or the node configuration that will be stored. Then we have this node registration option that basically is on the node or the kubelet specific setting. And now when the PR merges, we have a cluster configuration that contains everything else, but in the design should be everything that should be applied to the cluster level. Is that enough clear question about where we are now?
How does this get converged in like a rolling update for an upgrade? Does that have to rely on the component config API to diff against, like, say, the API server configuration?
We have all the machinery for converting from these to this configuration already in place and tested.
Yeah, the API machinery does this goof for us. The problem that we had before was because we conflate, this is kind of the separation of concerns and what part of the reason why we're doing it. The problem we had before is, like, say, for example, with that proxy issue, is that we absorbed it and had it in our config, and part of the machinery for the upgrade did not do the versioning of that piece. So separating out that, having that soft dependency allows us to manage and do the API machinery for just our stuff.
So I'm on the same page there. I'm asking maybe a simpler question, which is that, say, even between two of the same versions of cluster configuration, in a kubeadm upgrade from 111 to 112 or 112 to 113, the API servers are going to have configuration drift as the rolling update is applied to the cluster. And I'm curious how that is, how that's supposed to be represented, or if there's a plan to represent that drift. Like, is this just a declaration that we're making into kubeadm, and it's kubeadm's job when invoked on that particular API server to make the configuration match, and that if you just don't run it on one of the control plane nodes, then that node is just out of date? No,
basically you are reading the config map, and then you pass the config map to the API machinery, and the API machinery automatically converted to the latest version in the code base, to the internal version of the API in the code base. And when you save the API the config map back, it will be serialized in the latest version. So during the update, you read the old version, you convert in the new one, you use the new one, and you save the new one.
Yeah, what I'm getting at is, say that during an upgrade, I changed the API server configuration to disable node ports, right? Then how is that config represented, since the cluster configuration?
Those args, if you do custom args, because we eliminated in 1.11, we eliminated a ton of arguments that were plumbing through kubeadm to have custom arguments into the kubeadm config that were basically overrides to the API server or other components. In 1.11, we eliminated a ton of that stuff to only have what we needed to trim it down and to prevent the proliferation of configuration knobs. So we could move to beta and then to GA. So if you do custom args passing through, the responsibility is on you. And
yes, this is what is
I'm just
kind.
all I'm confused about is that cluster configuration. I guess what I'm getting hung up on is that it's supposed to be representative of the entire cluster, but during an update operation, like as you're rolling things out, it's only a progressive like representation of the actual state because there's drift. So I'm just wondering how, like, if there's any plan to represent that or handle that.
So the Grand Unified Component config for API server has been a long-standing gripe for the entire community. If they were to do that and actually have proper versioning semantics on the component config for the API server, it's a win-win. But I don't know when we're going to get there. That's the ideal scenario, because then they support their own upgrading across the configuration. It really should be on the API server, folks.
May I add, try to clarify something? I think that the only real support scenario for upgrades is that an upgrade that doesn't change any feature, or any attributes, any flag. This is the only upgrade part that we are testing. Then, by chance, I think that the only exception I remember is that you can change the feature flags.
I mean, as features
yes.
get added to the components, like we frequently enable them as default in kubeadm, and so it's a very common case that people upgrading from default to default will be changing API server configuration.
Yes, but what happened during an upgrade? And this gives you a kind of backdoor for doing also other changes. Doing an upgrade, basically, you recreate the control plane. So if before doing upgrade, you change some configuration in your config maps before upgrading, then the upgrade procedures create the new control plane instance with the new settings. So this is a kind of backdoor, but not really officially supported. I don't know, what do you think, Tim, about this?
It seems totally fine to me. I think once people go into custom arguments that are passed through, and if the API machinery, I mean, it's part of the release notes, right? So the release note for the API server will specify like these arguments have been deprecated and these other ones are taking its place, or this feature has been deprecated and moving over to here. Because we offer that plumbing through, they can always update the plumbing on upgrade. I think YOLOing upgrades is a super dangerous thing. You should never just like, let's just do an upgrade and see what happens. So it needs to be taken with a certain amount of care. Either way, regardless of kubeadm, like any configuration management tool, right? Because we don't have proper support in the configuration to do conversion.
Cool. Well, I think I'm hearing what I need to hear. We're not actually talking about what I'm asking about. but it sounds to me like the drift that occurs during a component upgrade or a component update of configuration, it's more accurate to say that the cluster configuration object is the desired state for all of those components across the cluster when kubeadm operates on it. But that this is not something that's actively converged, and it's not something that we should use to depend on reading what we should expect from the cluster. It's purely a user declaration of what is desired. And per node would be the additional bit there.
I would like to point out that code freeze is like pretty much in a couple of weeks. So
when feature freeze is the 28th, right?
The code is
excuse me, I confused test freeze. Okay. Yeah, my point is that it's kind of late in the cycle to make such changes. And I guess we should continue with what we have. I mean, the proposal has been there like the whole cycle, basically. And we didn't get that much feedback from others. So I think we should continue. Basically, we are out of time for this meeting almost.
Do you want to do a really brief run through, Fabrizio? You got like 4 minutes to talk about the other changes that are in flight.
Yes, I think that the next change is that will be to restructure, to improve the control plane configuration by using substructure, because now in the cluster configuration we have attributes about many components, but they are kind of mixed together. So we are creating substructure for the API server, controller manager configuration, and scheduler configuration. And then there will be another step, which is where I would like to have some feedback. I will chat in Slack to find out the best way to do this. Is that we need to move outside the cluster configuration the set of configuration which are specific for one API instance, or one API server instance. And this can be done by nesting into the node registration, which I don't know if it is a good solution, because node registration was designed for the node or kubelet. Can be done by creating two different structure, one which is the API server instance configuration, and maybe rename the node registration option to kubelet instance configuration, just to be specific, or to eventually to nest those two structures into.
Could you help us understand what node specific config you would need per API server?
Yes, the API adversary address, maybe the bind port, and also the list of certificate additional names.
Sorry, you said, because advertise address is a list, and that gets propagated to kubeproxy. Is that what that is?
No, the advertise address is specific for each API server instance.
Well, they can all have the same advertise address in like a load balancer configuration, but I think.
Yes, but there are many possible way to do the chain. So
that's what I'm trying to remember the finer details of this, because I think kubeproxy automatically creates endpoints for the Kubernetes service, and it is a list of all of the responding API servers and their individual advertise addresses. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. The advertise address are by instance.
I have to cut us off because there's back-to-back meetings. So I do think we should continue this conversation, but perhaps we should do it ad hoc, maybe set up something if we need to, or we can take it to Slack for the time being. But I know that there's another meeting that's coming in now, so we should probably close up now.
Okay, let's chat in Slack how to manage this, because
Okay.
the time is running.
Yep.
Bye all. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.